Greetings, all. Tonight we delve into a topic less abstract and arguably more salient should you ever find yourselves devoid of current, flowing conduits, or any inkling of contemporary plumbing. The resourcefulness of bygone era's survival. So, before settling in, I implore you to engage that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely appreciate the substance I meticulously craft here. Furthermore, do impart in the comments your geographical coordinates and the present temporal marker. It's truly captivating to witness our global constituency, perhaps even now engaged in the procurement of provisions. Now, dim the ambient illumination, perhaps activate a ventilating device for that subtle background resonance, and let us collectively embark on this evening's expedition. In the epoch of the Middle Ages, flame was not a mere convenience. It was the quintessential element. Warmth, culinary preparation, luminosity, defense, and potentially your sole confidant during a septenary tempest within a straw-thatched domicile. Thus, upon egressing, one did not convey comestibles. One conveyed fire. Behold the mobile pyre packet, the medieval analogue of a modern igniter. If that igniter were sluggish, subtly redolent of domesticated animals, and capable of incinerating your entire conveyance through imprudent manipulation. Its modus operandi, one would extract a glowing ember from the domestic hearth, typically carbonized wood, and ensconce it within desiccated bryophytes, mycological specimens, or decaying lignum, frequently nested within a hollowed-out bovine protuberance or a flame-resistant epidermic receptacle. Occasionally, it was sheathed in linen pre-imbibed with niter or rendered animal adipose for prolonged smoldering. The ember would persist in its incandescence for multitudinous hours, occasionally even a complete diurnal cycle, poised for reanimation with a gentle insufflation and a modicum of tender encouragement, much akin to one's morale following a plebeian fiscal assessment. This entire contraption was light, re-employable, and utterly indispensable. It spared one the arduous ordeal of laboriously striking sparks from silicate and ferrous alloys for a continuous demi-hour whilst feigning prodigious expertise. Ignition was notoriously fickle, particularly if your tinder became saturated or your manual appendages contorted into pathetic, avian-like vestiges. To transport fire meant one could enter a clearing, erect a rudimentary shelter, unfurl one's bryophyte-clad marvel, and with a puff of air and a whispered supplication to Saint Smoky of the incandescent remnant, command flames for pottage, warmth, or dramatic chiaroscuro narrative. One could even proffer one to a neighboring sojourner en route to the marketplace, literally transmitting the torch, for no individual yearned to be the one compelled to solicit fire at twilight. Socially awkward, and occasionally met with a sardonic, should have brought your moss, Gerald. Should you ever have contemplated a contemporary survivalist's larder, it is fundamentally a panorama of vacuum-sealed aspirations, desiccated flesh, leguminous matter, enigmatic preserved cylindrical vessels from 2011, and sufficient freeze-dried stroganoff to weather a minor cataclysm whilst retaining the capacity for mild complaint. Yet, medieval denizens preserved flesh in the time-honored manner, with smoke, saline agents, and the silent apprehension of gastronomic void when February arrived. Now, most individuals today conflate the fumigation of meat with a grilling apparatus, a potable libation, and mild barbecue-induced grandiosity. But in the Middle Ages, smoke transcended mere sapidity. It was about unadulterated persistence. And not just any smoke. This was meticulously calibrated, surreptitious smoke, cloaked smoke. You see, within numerous domiciles, particularly humble cottages featuring open hearths, Meat was not ostentatiously displayed above the flames akin to a fantastical epic. It was suspended behind the fire, nestled high within the ceiling timbers, inaccessible to fauna, progeny, and that perpetually uninvited dining companion. Why behind the fire? Because that was the locus where cooler smoke gently meandered, slow and unwavering, ascending through the habitation and enshrouding whatever unfortunate fowl or porcine portion one had managed to acquire. Over the course of days, weeks, and even months, the smoke would desiccate the flesh, extirpate bacteria, deter insectile incursions, and ensure your cured pork outlasted your New Year's sanguinity. This was not your saccharine applewood barbecue vapor. This was coniferous and desperate smoke, dense, pungent, and rich with character. After a few lunar cycles, the meat became indurate, darkened, and thoroughly fortified against putrefaction, vermin, and unforeseen kin visitations. Moreover, concealed meat smoked more gradually and was more challenging to purloin. This was pivotal when residing in a hamlet where I failed to perceive your sausage suspended there was, astonishingly, a tenable legal defense. And let us not disregard the bipartite advantage. Whilst the meat underwent fumigation, the dwelling remained warm and vermin-resistant. Nothing quite articulates a snug medieval evening like reposing beneath a smouldering ham in an atmosphere permeated with smoke and yearning. Modern preppers are enamored with pyrometric defenses, motion-activated transducers, tripwires, aerial surveillance drones, and that singular individual who resolutely asserts their canid can discern plunderers from a league's distance. But medieval individuals possessed their own form of territorial safeguarding, requiring neither electrochemical cells, vociferation, nor wireless connectivity. It was denominated a vital enclosure. And yes, it was precisely as its appellation suggested. Envision endeavoring to contain your bovines and exclude your neighbor's progeny without employing lumber, metallic fasteners, or objurgation. The resolution: cultivate your barrier. Living enclosures, also known as vegetated demarcations, were fashioned by planting rapidly proliferating, pliant arboreal species such as Salix, Crataegus, Corylus, or Prunus spinosa in close proximity. As they matured, one did not merely permit them to ascend like overachieving herbaceous plants. Nay, one flexed, interwove, and interlaced the ramifying structures into a dense, formidable barrier capable of arresting a swine, redirecting a goose, and utterly ruining a larcenist's twilight. It was not merely efficacious but also graceful in a spinos, almost bellicose manner. Some enclosures were laid, signifying the trunks were partially transected and bent horizontally, fostering novel growth whilst remaining viable. Others integrated thorny vegetation that served as both a burglar deterrent and a readily available drupaceous source, assuming one possessed the manual dexterity of a masochist. And herein lies its allure. Vital enclosures accrued fortitude over time. Unlike ligneous enclosures that succumb to putrefaction, collapse, and invite every carpenter in the vicinage to tender an estimate, vegetated demarcations became thicker, denser, and more impervious with each passing annum. Medieval agrarianists were not merely constructing partitions, they were cultivating bastions. They also fulfilled manifold objectives. Avians nested within them, pollinators adored them, and they curtailed edaphic erosion. Essentially, they were medieval multitools. If your multitool featured thorns, apidae, and the occasional concealed Mustela putorius furo. They were also aesthetically pleasing. Some vegetated demarcations still discernible in Albion today exceed 700 years in antiquity, signifying they have outlasted conflicts, monarchs, and several attempts at secession. When the phrase argillaceous power reservoir assails your auditory perception, you might envision cloistered monastic figures in acuminated headwear electrifying a neurons with static discharge, or medieval commoners inadvertently conceptualizing the automobile. But no, this particular type of reservoir bore no relation to electrical phenomena and everything to do with thermoregulation. Long before thermostatic devices, compact refrigerated units, or the locution climatic apprehension. Argil, it transpires, is not solely for serumology, dubious statuary, and pre-kindergarten projects. In the medieval milieu, it was also an unsung marvel of thermal mass, which is a sophisticated locution for asserting it adheres to heat or cold with the tenacity of a resolute matriarch clinging to grievances. Let us deconstruct this. Medieval habitations and alimentary storage pits frequently utilized argil-lined vessels or walls to govern temperature. In the estival period, argil maintained comestibles at a lower temperature than the ambient atmosphere. In the hibernal period, it retained heat for a longer duration than most construction materials. This was not speculative fiction. It was simply physica employing telluric matter. Individuals would store lacteal fluid, churned cream, or pottage in englazed argil receptacles saturated with aqua. As the aqua vaporized from the porous surface, it chilled the contents, akin to a medieval refrigeration unit, but more parsimonious, quieter, and less prone to imparting a halogenated hydrocarbon flavor to your residual provisions. Some even interred argil pots in hypergeal chambers or shaded excavations where the Earth's consistent subterranean temperature aided in preserving comestibles, potables, and occasionally grandmother's emergency malus tart. They could also be warmed near a pyre, then employed to gradually discharge heat throughout the nocturnal period. Argil bricks were positioned in sleeping arrangements, beneath sartorial coverings, or even enveloped in ovine fleece and transported on wheeled conveyances, the medieval counterpart of a thermophore, but more telluric. And unlike contemporary power reservoirs, these never detonated. At worst, they merely fractured and quietly ceased their functionality. If you have ever vociferated at a frying pan because your avian reproductive cells decided to permanently conjoin with it, you might appreciate the marvels of non-adhesive coatings. But if you inhabited the Middle Ages, long before non-stick surfaces and nocturnal televised advertisements, you relied on something far simpler and considerably more blister-inducing: frictional glazing. Indeed, medieval individuals meticulously burnished their culinary vessels by hand to forge a smooth, semi-resistant surface that helped mitigate alimentary adherence. It was not sorcery, and it was not without blemish, but it performed astonishingly well, especially if your anticipations were already shattered by a lifetime of brassica-based disillusions. Its operational paradigm, pottery, particularly culinary ware, was typically fabricated from coarse argil, which is about as non-stick as abrasive paper. But by vigorously abrading the still damp pots with smooth lithic fragments, osseous implements, or even indurate lignum, they compressed the surface, aligning particulate matter and sealing pores. This laborious polishing engendered a subtle luster known as a burnished glaze. Envision an individual dedicating a demodiurnal period to massaging a pottage vessel as if it owed them tender. That is frictional glazing. Now, did this prevent everything from adhering? No, this was not a thaumaturgic feat. It was medieval ingenuity, but it sufficiently reduced alimentary adherence to facilitate simpler ablution and less encrustated pottage. Some even coated their burnished pots with a slender stratum of animal adipose, then subjected them to pyrotechnic treatment to aid in sealing the surface, a kind of prehistoric conditioning process. It also augmented the longevity of the pots by rendering them more resistant to aqua and fissuring. And for added appeal, burnished pots possessed a more aesthetically pleasing countenance. In an epoch when most objects were drab, ligneous, or in a state of decay, a resplendent cooking vessel was essentially the medieval equivalent of kitchen ornamentation. Of course, the procedure was labor-intensive and likely inflicted permanent scapular maladies upon numerous ceramists, but it represented the distinction between serviceable culinary ware and a receptacle that transmuted porridge into plaster. Modern survivalists might disperse hundreds on titanium cookware or whatever the latest anti-adhesive marvel is. But medieval folk, they simply seated themselves, grasped a lithic fragment, and persisted in abrading until the pot relented. Rudimentary, perhaps. Efficacious, absolutely. Long before satellite-based global positioning systems, digital cartographic displays, and that singular acquaintance who adamantly asserts their knowledge of a shortcut and unequivocally does not, individuals were compelled to navigate by audial cues, particularly in dense nebulosity or sylvans, or those charming medieval crepuscules when the mist was so profound one could not discern one's own cartwheel. Enter the forgotten faculty of sonorous navigation. Not a prodigious ability, not chiropteran echolocation, but pragmatic survival through meticulous auditory apprehension. And frankly, we do not accord our forebears sufficient recognition for this. These were individuals who could identify their communal settlement by the inclination of a campanological resonance and gauge their degree of disorientation by the plethora of barking canids. Let us postulate you are perambulating. No directional compass, no prominent terrestrial features, merely nebulosity, quagmire, and a profound suspicion that you are circumambulating. You orient your auditory organs to the bells, ecclesiastical bells, bovine bells, even strategically positioned clappers or gongs in certain localities. Communal settlements frequently tolled their ecclesiastical bells, not solely for devotional services, but as auditory beacons, sounds that penetrated the mist and reminded one that civilization still persisted somewhere. Herds were often adorned with bovine bells or ovine bells, not merely so one could relocate them after they wandered off to instigate mischief, but so one could track the sound homeward, assuming one did not pursue the incorrect herd and ultimately find oneself in Gerald's pasturage once more. Forests and montane defiles sometimes featured Aeolian chimes, clanging metallic vessels, or drums suspended from arboreal structures to aid in delineating pathways. A clamor on the breeze signified one was progressing in the correct trajectory, or at least a trajectory someone had traversed previously and possibly survived. Piscatorial practitioners employed cornua and acoustic reflections to ascertain harbor entrances. Itinerant individuals would vociferate, applaud, or strike lignum to estimate distances by echoic return. Primitive sonar, sans the neoprene garment. Even public houses proved beneficial. Many boasted musical performers or boisterous colloquy that permeated the thoroughfare like a beacon of fermented security. Follow the commotion and you would discover warmth, sustenance, and possibly your consanguineous relative recumbent beneath a bench. Should you have resided in the Middle Ages and desired to avert the premature degradation of your dental structures, you possessed one primary recourse: charcoal. Not dentifrice, not interdental cleansing filaments, merely incinerated organic matter. Medieval individuals did not precisely possess contemporary oral hygiene products. What they possessed was carbonized lignum, pulverized into a pulverulent state and commingled with saline, desiccated herbs, or comminuted testacea shells, applied directly to the dental structures using digits, sticks, or, in the instance of the particularly sartorially astute, a textile bound around a twig. This rudimentary admixture functioned as a sort of dental abrasive that could polish enamel, remove alimentary accumulation, and perhaps, if the celestial entities were benevolent, postpone complete dental collapse until one's quadragesimal year. Now, was it agreeable? Unquestionably not. Abutting abrasive ash against your dental structures feels precisely as its description implies, like masticating sand during a conflagration. But it was preferable to the alternative, which was permitting plaque to proliferate unimpeded until your gingiva orchestrated a violent insurgency. Charcoal also possessed mild antibacterial properties, signifying it aided in combating halitosis. To a degree, fresh breath in the medieval context implied you could engage in discourse within 3 feet of another individual without eliciting lacrimation. Some formulations incorporated mentha, rosmarinus, or salvia, not for efficacy, but for the semblance of cleanliness. Others swore by post-charcoal acetous rinses, which likely negated any benefits of the charcoal and added a pleasant enamel-eroding perquisite. Dental procedures when circumstances deteriorated involved pliers, robust manual strength, and a complete absence of anesthesia. So yes, anointing your molars with ashes suddenly appeared to be a remarkably appealing option. Today, charcoal has re-emerged in fashionable dentifrices and restorative treatments. But let us be unequivocal. Medieval folk did not employ it for aesthetic trends. They employed it because the sole other choice was having their dental structures extracted by an individual named Bartholomew who also honed bladed implements. Let us be forthright. Contemporary habitation primarily comprises gypsiferous board, hardened aggregate, and self-assembled furnishings that disintegrate if you merely contemplate leaning upon them improperly. But medieval plebeians constructed domiciles from ramifying structures, telluric matter, culm, and unadulterated sanguinity. The technique? It was denominated wattle and daub, which sounds like an eccentric folk collective but was in fact the bedrock of quotidian survival architecture. Its operational scheme: firstly, one commences with wattle, which is simply a sophisticated appellation for interwoven ramifying structures, twigs, or long, pliable sticks. Envision basketry, but taller, colder, and significantly more prone to collapsing upon your caprid. These wattle panels were then secured between ligneous posts, forming what resembled the skeletal framework of a highly disoriented fence. Next arrived the daub, a charming, manually commingled concoction of mud, culm, argil, and animal excrement. Yes, excrement. Because in the Middle Ages, if it wasn't at least partially composed of fertilizing effluvium, were you even exerting effort? This delightful paste was smeared into the wattle and permitted to desiccate, forming a surprisingly robust, insulated wall. It repelled the wind, retained heat, and emitted the kind of rustic aroma that proclaimed, "Sweet home, slightly composting home." Now, it was not glamorous. Your walls might occasionally fissure, exfoliate, or attract inquisitive gallinaceous fowl, and mending them was simply part of your hebdomadal itinerary, nestled between evade starvation and chide the neighbor's caprid. But it was inexpensive, efficacious, and best of all, locally sourced. No shipping imposts, no carbon footprint, just telluric matter, labor, and possibly a touch of psychic trauma. Despite its ostensibly primitive nature, wattle and daub could endure for decades, even centuries, with proper maintenance. Some medieval habitations still extant today feature their original wattle walls, implying that some plebeian in 1350 performed a superior task to your most recent contractor. Picture medieval slumber, a flimsy culm mattress filled with compunction, a thatched roof exuding something suspicious, and the perpetual menace of Siphonaptera, Theraptera, and creatures that vibrate, lacerate, or creep with dubious self-assurance. Enter the surprisingly refined resolution. Herb-imbued bedding, a rustic amalgamation of aromatherapy and pest control. Devised not out of opulence, but because medieval plebeians harbored no desire to awaken as a repast for parasitic organisms. You see, stuffing your mattress with unadorned culm was simply inviting companionship, the irritable, spasmodic, sanguivorous kind. So instead, astute households incorporated powerfully scented herbs like lavandula, mentha, Artemisia absinthium, Mentha pulegium, and Rosmarinus officinalis. Not for lavishness, but for protection. These herbs were nature's medieval insect deterrent. Their potent aromas repelled Siphonaptera, Theraptera, and Culicidae, and occasionally your spouse. Some herbs like Tanacetum vulgare or Ruta graveolens were even believed to ward off malevolent specters. Conveniently, they also deterred intrusive affinal relatives. The outcome: a bed that smelled like a suspiciously pleasant herbaceous blend and kept the creeping things at bay for a few nocturnal periods, at least. After that, you had to replenish the herbs or risk being violently awakened by anixids with anger management issues. It did not conclude with mattresses either. Herbs were disseminated across floors, interwoven into door frames, and suspended in fascicles above beds. Essentially, if you could insert a sprig of Artemisia absinthium into it, you did. It transmuted domiciles into slightly unsettling apothecaries, but cleaner, safer, and more fragrant than the neighbor's caprid shelter. In an epoch predating insect netting and modern repellents, this was brilliant. Entire scholarly works were composed on which herbs performed optimally. Some individuals even held the conviction that somnolent experiences were sweeter when reposing on lavandula. Scientific validity? Debatable. But if it helped you forget the humid ceiling and the fact that your pillow was a sack of Avena, then bless it. Long before the era of refrigerators humming in culinary chambers and illuminated songulation compartments replete with forgotten legumes, medieval individuals were compelled to devise ingenious methodologies to prevent their alimentary provisions from metamorphosing into scientific experiments. Enter the marvel of passive preservation: lithic cooling shelves, also known as slab shelves, larders, or, to articulate it plainly, that frigid petrous surface where we domicile the coagulated lacteal product. Its operational scheme: thick slabs of stone, frequently slate or marble if one possessed economic means, were integrated into the shaded walls of domiciles, particularly on the septentrional-facing aspect where direct solar radiation rarely impinged. These lithic shelves absorbed the naturally cooler temperatures of the telluric matter and ambient atmosphere, creating a sort of innate cold zone, essentially a medieval miniature refrigerator, but with less cacophony and more arachnids. In cooler months, they prevented lacteal fluid, churned cream, flesh, and whatever constituted residual provisions from spoiling with undue rapidity. Even in warmer weather, the lithic material remained cooler than the atmosphere due to its thermal mass, which is scientific jargon for rock is indifferent to external temperature. No electrical conduits, no motive mechanisms, no luminescent bulb to expose your nocturnal snacking at 0200 hours. Merely lithic material, umbrage, and unadulterated hope. Some domiciles even featured entire lithic pantries or frigid chambers with thick walls and telluric floors. These were precursors to modern subterranean food storage areas, and they were typically situated as far as possible from the culinary pyre. Because while medieval individuals relished hot pottage, they did not desire it gradually warming their churned cream storage. In more affluent households, these shelves could be lined with damp textiles or porous amphorae filled with evaporating aqua to augment the cooling effect. A clever application of physica without ever articulating the term evaporative. In less prosperous homes, it was simply place the lacteal fluid on the frigid slab and hope it does not coagulate before midday. These days, should you incur a sprain of an ankle or suffer an insectile sting, you procure a cryotherapeutic pack, analgesic compounds, or perhaps a gelatinous substance that proffers frigorific relief and delivers mild disillusionment. But in the Middle Ages, when medicine often involved sanguisuga or someone murmuring Latin over a bovine horn, individuals possessed a more accessible, less terrifying alternative: brassica leaves. Yes, brassica. The humble vegetable now known for vitiating scholastic repasts and rendering boiled dishes redolent of despair once played a starring role in medieval rudimentary therapeutics. Brassica folia poultices were employed for everything from tumefaction and contusions to mastitis, articular discomfort, and the occasional plague-adjacent enigmatic exanthema. The rationale? Straightforward. Brassica is frigorific, pliable, and mildly antimicrobial. A natural compress that came pre-packaged in its own leafy wrapping. You would select a large, preferably chilled, brassica leaf, gently crush it to release its juices, and then enfold it around the afflicted area, often securing it with linen or a touch of sanguinity. The effect was surprisingly soothing. The leaf's cool moisture aided in reducing inflammation, while its natural compounds, including sulfur, flavonoids, and sufficient agricultural aroma to keep kin at arm's length, managed the remainder. Some healers would warm the leaves instead, contingent upon the ailment. For thoracic congestion or aching articulations, a heated brassica poultice was the medieval equivalent of a modern mentholated rub, only leafier and less minty. And unlike many treatments of the era, it did not entail phlebotomy or incantations beneath the lunar orb. It was simple, reproducible, and required neither a tutored monk nor a full lunar sacrifice. Merely a brassica and a measure of forbearance. Of course, during lean periods, those same leaves might ultimately find their way into your pottage vessel once their medicinal purpose was served, which instills a whole new stratum of appreciation for medieval fortitude and gastrointestinal systems forged of ferrous material. Prior to electricity, manufactured oleaginous cylinders, or the self-satisfied radiance of a solar-powered luminous apparatus, medieval individuals were compelled to innovate to repel the encroaching tenebrosity. And when pyrotechnic devices were exorbitant and oleaginous cylinders were reserved for ecclesiastical edifices or the affluent, quotidian folk turned to something more economical, more odorous, and strangely efficacious: surpus igniters, also known as bacon torches for the fiscally prudent. So what precisely constitutes a surpus igniter? Envision a long, slender reed or surpus plant, commonly found in paludal locales. essentially everywhere one wished to avoid perambulating barefoot. These rushes were desiccated, denuded of their external integument, and then saturated in animal adipose, typically cured porcine drippings, ovine tallow, or anything vaguely oleaginous and not immediately requisite for dinner. The outcome, a slow-combusting, semi-flammable wick that could be propped up in a metallic clasp and ignited like an oleaginous cylinder. The illumination was not precisely romantic. It sputtered, emitted effluvium, and possessed all the charm of a bacon-scented conflagration hazard. But it functioned. And in the Middle Ages, that was sufficient. Each surface igniter could combust anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes, contingent upon the thoroughness of its saturation and the thickness of the rush. If more temporal duration was needed, another was ignited. If superior illumination was desired, one simply approached closer. And if your surface igniter extinguished in a draughty chamber, well, welcome to the delightful realm of medieval darkness. Surface igniters were not solely for illumination. However, they also served as temporal markers. Need to boil something for the duration of a demi-surface igniter? Accomplished. Desire to ascertain how long it takes Gerald to return from the Cerevisual establishment? Ignite one and enumerate. They were inexpensive, rapid to produce, and surprisingly sustainable, assuming one did not object to one's domicile subtly redolent of fried porcine flesh and marsh water. Today, we domicile churned cream in refrigerated units, plastical receptacles, or within artisanal ligneous churns if you are truly committed to emulating existence on a Victorian lacteal farm. But in the Middle Ages, refrigeration was not an option. So naturally, someone gazed upon a peatland and thought, yes, let us deposit the lacteal product therein. And thus, Paludal churned cream came into existence. Paludal churned cream is precisely as its appellation suggests, churned cream, or occasionally rendered animal adipose, interred in a peat bog. Why a bog? Because despite being replete with mud, insectile entities, and beings that likely hiss when perturbed, bogs are frigid, oxygen-deprived, and acidic, nature's least inviting yet surprisingly efficacious preservation chamber. Individuals would take substantial quantities of churned cream, enshroud them in textile, cortical material, or even ligneous barrels, and inter them deep within the peat. And not for mere hours. We are discussing months, years, or in some instances, centuries. Archaeologists in Hibernia have unearthed paludal churned cream exceeding 3,000 years in antiquity. That is correct. Some ancient Celtic plebeian's forgotten comestible is now in a museum instead of on Ponies Tostas. The frigid, anoxic bog prevented bacteria and fungi from spoiling the churned cream, and the tannins in the peat aided in inhibiting oxidation. The outcome, a strangely preserved mass of lacteal product that, according to courageous contemporary gustatory evaluators, smells of coagulated lacteal fluid, smoke, and telluric compunction. Now, was this the staple for your quotidian culinary churned cream? No, this was for long-term survival storage, likely utilized for hibernal provisions, tribute, or that consanguineous relative who always arrived uninvited in spring requesting alimentary sustenance. Interring your churned cream in a bog also offered the advantage of security. Desire to deter larcenists? Conceal your valuable possessions in a freezing, ankle-deep muddy depression. No one is excavating for breakfast in that. If you are envisioning medieval individuals dwelling in snug, hobbit-like domiciles with rustic larders and shelves of meticulously labeled preserved goods, reconsider. Alimentary storage was often less aesthetically pleasing and more about please do not let this turn putrid before winter claims us all. And one of the most ingenious solutions, hollow arboreal structures. Yes, the original self-growing pantry, requiring no carpentering whatsoever, and endowed with built-in camouflage. Hollow arboreal structures were remarkably prevalent across the medieval landscape. Whether naturally formed from age, fulminous impacts, decay, or overly zealous sciurity, these cavities became impromptu storage units for plebeians, itinerants, and anyone with perishable provisions and no superior alternatives. Need to conceal coagulated lacteal fluid, desiccated flesh, or malus away from the domicile. Insinuate it into an arboreal structure. Desire to prevent alimentary provisions from being purloined by the neighbor's caprid, or worse, the neighbor? Arboreal structure. Traversing the sylvans and requiring a frigid locus to store that dubious Phasianus culchicus you discovered? Arboreal structure. The interior of a hollow arboreal structure provided umbrage, insulation, and natural concealment. The thick cortical layer and enclosed cavity maintained relatively stable temperatures and helped decelerate spoilage. Not ideal for extended preservation, but perfect for short-term storage, especially during cooler months. Some even lined the interior with foliar structures, bryophytes, or cortical material to keep items desiccated and impart a touch of that rustic medieval aroma. Others placed alimentary provisions inside ceramic or epidermic containers before tucking them into the hollow, which at least gave the impression that sciuridae were not sampling your dinner. It was not solely for alimentary provisions, either. Hollow arboreal structures were also utilized to secrete valuable possessions, weaponry, herbal remedies, and in a pinch, small children during raids, not as a childcare methodology. A good arboreal structure could signify the distinction between starvation and survival, or at least the distinction between frigid coagulated lacteal fluid and suspiciously warm coagulated lacteal fluid. In the realm of survival, consuming cortical material typically signals circumstances have gone gravely awry. But in the Middle Ages, it was actually a legitimate survival element. Introducing cortical ponies, a medieval delicacy that proclaims, I did not succumb to starvation, but I did masticate on a coniferous tree. During periods of scarcity, which were frequent, plebeians turned to the silver, not for venison or mycological specimens, too seasonal, too toxic, but for arboreal cortical material, specifically the inner bark or cambium from pinus, betula, or ulmus trees. This is not the tough external stratum. It is the soft, moist layer just beneath that was shaved off, desiccated, pulverized into farina, and commingled into ponies dough. Was it delectable? No. Was it nourishing? Surprisingly, yes. Cortical material contains fiber, trace minerals, and complex carbohydrates. It sustained individuals when grain reserves were depleted, imposts were due, and the bovines had mysteriously ceased lacteal production, likely collectivizing. Most recipes blended cortical farina with whatever was available, quercus nuts, urtica dioica, actual farina if you were fortunate, and baked it into flat, chewy loaves that resembled ponies and tasted like the silver. But when your options were cortical ponies or becoming cortical material yourself, you chose carbohydrates. Some individuals even toasted or roasted the cortical material before grinding, which imparted a smoky flavor, or at least diverted attention from the fact that you were consuming an arboreal structure. And it was not solely for commoners. During sieges and harsh hibernal periods, entire communities depended on cortical-based alimentary sustenance to endure, sometimes even regulating how much cambium could be harvested from communal sylvans. Excessive cortical collection and the arboreal structure perished. Insufficient, and the villagers did. So if the world concludes and you find yourself in the sylvans, no alimentary sustenance in sight, do not despair. Just locate a betula, channel your inner plebeian, and remember, you can unequivocally consume that. In the expanse between the Tigris and Euphrates, personal beautification was a quotidian rite. Ancient Mesopotamians did not merely groom themselves, they imbued it with ceremonial gravitas. For them, hygiene and adornment were indicia of refinement, divine approbation, and even political standing. One was not merely presenting a facade to the world. One was preparing oneself for celestial scrutiny. Let us commence with the ocular organs. Thick, melanic palpebral liner did not originate in Cleopatra's antechamber. It flourished centuries earlier in Sumer. Both virile and feminine individuals applied dramatic lines using kohl, a pulverized admixture of plumbum, cuprum, and stibium. While this might appall contemporary dermatologists, they believed it shielded them from malevolent entities and, more pragmatically, from the desert sun's intense glare. Their dermatological regimen would compel modern influences to pause. Comminuted semi-precious lithic fragments were integrated into oleaginous substances to exfoliate and brighten the complexion. Lutum from the fluviatile banks, rich in minerals, was smeared onto the corpus in thick, frigorific layers. After it desiccated, it was gently abraded away, leaving the cutis smooth and effulgent. Yes, the earliest argil masks were less about a spa day and more about ancient scientific praxis. Capillary removal constituted another arduous task. Utilizing sharpened conchiferous structures or rudimentary tweezers, they plucked, abraded, or singed off bodily hair. Smoothness was equated with sophistication and godliness. The more polished one's appearance, the closer one was to resembling divine perfection. Even their sculptures of deities and priestesses are devoid of hair and impeccably styled with symmetrical features and expansive, painted ocular organs. And let us not overlook the redolence. Aromatic oleaginous substances were not merely pleasant, they were potent. Myrrha, olibanum, and cedrus were infused into animal adipose and applied to the cutis as perfumed essences. Individuals believed these scents purified the corpus and appeased the celestial beings. In royal courts, perfumed oleaginous substances were so valuable that they were presented as tribute. Permanent facial enhancements are not a recent innovation. The practice of imbuing eyebrows with pigment, for instance, was already a hallowed tradition in ancient sanctuaries. In bygone eras, women inscribed their brows with carbon-based pigments or indigenous dyes, forging bold, commanding arches. If contemporary aesthetic pursuits strike you as extreme, contemplate Cleopatra's elaborate grooming, a veritable monument to unwavering commitment. Beyond her captivating charm, the Egyptian sovereign, famed for her eye artistry, personified the quintessential Greco-Roman ideal of comeliness. Her visage graced coinage, and her sway permeated every apothecary and private dressing chamber from Alexandria to Rome. She was not an isolated case. Roman women inherited Egypt's penchant for extravagance and subsequently amplified it. Consider, for example, the legendary milk bath. Lore suggests Cleopatra indulged daily in ablutions of ass's milk. Whether this involved a contingent of 500 donkeys or was merely a tenacious whisper of history, the essence remains. Lactic acid, present in soured milk, functions as a natural exfoliant. Romans enthusiastically embraced this custom, with affluent women immersing themselves in baths scented with milk, honey, and rose petals, convinced it would smooth lines and illuminate their complexions. It proved efficacious, though assuredly not fiscally prudent. Regarding facial aesthetics, Roman women yearned for a pallid, almost spectral skin tone, an unambiguous marker of wealth that afforded them seclusion from the sun's embrace. This engendered the application of ceruse, a profoundly toxic white lead facial powder. Despite its inherent peril, it conferred an impeccable, matte finish. Women applied lavish layers daily to their cheeks and foreheads. Over time, this precipitated dermal lesions, hair loss, and in certain instances, mortality, yet attaining a goddess-like mien was deemed a justifiable hazard. Blush and lip tint were concocted from rube scent ochre, pulverized coleoptera, or mulberry extract. The more vibrant the lips and cheeks, the more mesmerizing one appeared. For ocular and superciliary enhancement, soot commingled with animal adiposity sufficed. If natural eyebrows lacked distinctiveness, women would delineate them or, more notably, tattoo them, a practice also observed in Mesopotamian civilizations. Hair presented another domain for intricate beauty rites. Roman women sculpted elaborate curls using heated metallic rods, long predating modern curling implements. They tinctured their tresses with botanicals, ash, or even fermented hirudinea to attain a modish blonde shade. Wigs fashioned from Germanic servile hair were commonplace among elite Roman women, signaling their affluence and sartorial discernment. And then there was fragrance, a veritable empire in itself, as Romans were enthralled by scent. Oleaginous infusions of saffron, cinnamon, and roses were massaged into every part of the physique. Public bathhouses famously exuded the aroma of botanical paradises steeped in musk. In ancient China, beauty manifested less as overt display and more as philosophical principle. While Rome pursued ostentation, the Chinese aesthetic prized equilibrium, congruence, and inner qi. Yet, subtlety did not equate to simplicity. The grooming rituals of dynastic China were equally meticulous, deeply spiritual, and at times astonishingly intense. The skin held paramount importance. Chinese beauty standards revered a pale, porcelain-like complexion. This was not born of sun aversion, but rather as an emblem of nobility and leisure. Peasant women toiled under the sun, while aristocratic women sequestered themselves indoors, safeguarding their complexions like precious scrolls. White lead powder, finely ground pearl, and even pulverized rice were common components. These served not merely as cosmetics but also as therapeutic agents. Many formulations, devised by court physicians, were believed to amplify qi or prolong vitality. Yet, the true luminary of ancient Chinese skincare was jade. Jade rollers, recently repopularized by social media, were wielded centuries ago by women of the Han Dynasty. Cool to the touch and symbolically entwined with immortality, jade tools were glided across the face to invigorate circulation, diminish tumescence, and preserve youthful vibrancy. Even emperors reportedly slumbered on jade pillows, convinced the stone would draw out cutaneous toxins. Eyebrows constituted a significant facet of beauty. Women sculpted and tinted their brows to mirror both prevailing fashion and political declarations. Some dynasties favored lengthy, sweeping arches, while others preferred short, upward-angled lines. Ink derived from charred willow or charcoal was applied with brushes crafted from rabbit fur. Certain trends even encouraged the wholesale removal of natural brows to redraw them higher on the forehead, aiming for a more celestial appearance. Lips were tinted with a blend of cinnabar and animal adiposity, sometimes combined with beeswax. Rouge, extracted from safflower petals, was dabbed in minute circles on the cheeks. Deliberately applied beauty marks, tiny black puncta near the lips or eyes, were considered alluring emblems of charm and mystique. Hair care was a daily ritual. Women utilized fermented rice water and camellia oil to cleanse and nourish their tresses, often cultivating them to knee length. Elaborate updos, secured with jade pins and golden combs, were not merely stylish but proclaimed status, grace, and cultural refinement. For the ancient Chinese, beauty was neither clamorous nor lethal. It was contemplative, disciplined, and symbolic. It represented artistic restraint coupled with quiet influence, expressed through powdered visages and perfectly curved brows. If an epoch ever dawned where beauty literally claimed lives, it was the Renaissance. In the regal courts of Italy, England, and France, women were not simply augmenting their appearance. They were systematically self-poisoning in their inexorable quest for flawlessness. The ideal was an alabaster-white countenance with vibrant crimson lips and high, delicate brows. The methodology involved a chemical concoction that would appall a modern dermatologist. The most infamous was Venetian ceruse, a luxurious facial paste composed of white lead and vinegar. It conferred a smooth, stark white finish, artfully concealing imperfections and fine lines. Queen Elizabeth I famously employed it, and under the soft glow of candlelight, it imparted a luminous, porcelain-like radiance to the skin. The severe drawbacks encompassed skin corrosion, motor paralysis, dental decay, and ultimately, corporeal cessation. It was, in essence, a slow-acting aesthetic detonation. Then there was arsenic. For women yearning to brighten their complexions or diminish freckles, arsenic wafers were peddled as miraculous elixirs. Ingesting minute doses purportedly created a translucent skin appearance, but it also induced emesis, renal impairment, and internal hemorrhage. Yet, aesthetic imperatives eclipsed concerns for one's hepatic function. Eyebrows were meticulously extirpated into slender arches or entirely expunged. A high, rounded forehead was fashionable, leading women to sometimes shave their hairlines an inch or two to cultivate the illusion of a more capacious intellect and, by extension, elevated virtue. Alopecia was reinterpreted as a mark of elevated standing. Cheek color originated from crushed berries, cochineal insects, or vermilion. Lips were painted with analogous mixtures, and some women utilized mercury-based red dyes, which provided a seductive burst of color but inflicted irreversible neural damage. Flushed cheeks were not merely attractive. They signaled youth and vitality, highly prized by aristocrats in an era of truncated lifespans. Potent fragrances like ambergris, musk, and civet were applied profusely not only for allure but to mask body odor beneath layers of toxic cosmetics, as bathing was often regarded with suspicion in many parts of Europe. Golden hair constituted the ideal, particularly in Italy. Women bleached their hair with concoctions of sulfur, soda, and lemon juice, then basked in the sun wearing wide-brimmed hats with apertures to expose only their hair. This technique proved effective, but also severely compromised their scalps. Long before contemporary skincare championed natural ingredients, ancient India had already perfected it. More than mere dermatological care, it was Ayurveda, the science of life. Indian beauty rites were intrinsic to spiritual well-being, dietary practice, and inner equilibrium. Beauty was perceived as the outward manifestation of one's dosas, or fundamental energies. Bathing was a sacred ceremony. Women of the Vedic period immersed themselves in turmeric-infused water or milk, followed by exfoliation with uptan, a paste of chickpea flour, sandalwood, turmeric, milk, and rose water. This brightened the skin, retarded the aging process, and purified energy. There were no parabens or microplastics, only kitchen components that also served as hallowed medicaments. Hair was considered a crowning glory. Coconut oil, amla, Indian gooseberry, and hibiscus were steeped in warm oils and massaged into the scalp to stimulate growth, pacify the mind, and prevent premature graying. Thick, waist-length hair symbolized vitality and feminine essence. Hair oiling sessions were communal, intimate, and meditative. Kajol, the dark eyeliner still prevalent in India today, possessed spiritual origins. Crafted from soot and ghee, it was believed to repel the malevolent gaze. Mothers applied it to themselves and their progeny as a protective ward against adverse forces. It also exquisitely framed the eyes, imbuing them with the profundity of ancient verse. Fragrance constituted an empire unto itself. Cities like Kanauj gained renown for distilling attas, perfumes derived from blossoms such as jasmine, rose, and vetiver. These oils were caressed onto the skin, integrated into hair care, and even blended into bath water. Their purpose extended beyond allure to spiritual lucidity, aiding in the alignment of the senses with the divine. Lip and cheek tints originated from beetroot, saffron, and crushed rose petals. Teeth were purified with neem sticks and charcoal long before the advent of plastic toothbrushes. Even oral hygiene was a ritual, synchronized with lunar cycles and linked to doshic balance. Perhaps most distinctive was mehndi, henna, employed to adorn hands and feet, particularly during matrimonial ceremonies. Henna was not merely cosmetic. It cooled the body, alleviated stress, and signified joy, fecundity, and metamorphosis. Every intricate volute in the design narrated a story. The ancient Greeks admired beauty, yet not with the ostentatious, opulent flair of subsequent empires. For them, beauty was inherently moral. Physical flawlessness mirrored a virtuous soul. A sculpted physique or harmonious countenance was not solely appealing. It signaled inner equilibrium, intellectual prowess, and divine approbation. Thus, grooming in classical Greece was virtually a civic obligation. Skin was a paramount concern. Like Romans, Greeks idealized pale complexions, indicative of leisure and aristocratic standing. A sun-kissed face implied manual labor, typical for enslaved individuals and peasants. To attain this spectral ideal, Greek women utilized powders derived from white lead, again, chalk, or pulverized seashells. These powders were far from subtle. Some women applied them so thickly that they visibly cracked when they smiled. But beauty exacted sacrifice. Crimson lips and cheeks were sourced from mulberries, red iron oxide, or even vinous dregs. The richer the red, the more coveted the appearance, but application had to be judicious. A modest blush signified robust health and chastity. Excessive application was associated with hetairi, courtesans known for employing more vibrant rouge and elaborate cosmetics to entertain philosophers and statesmen. Hair care was not an afterthought. Greek women cherished long, undulating hair, often styled in braids, chignons, or knots and secured with ivory or bronze pins. To lighten their tresses, they massaged in vinegar, lemon juice, and sometimes ash. Blonde hair was particularly idealized as divine and exotic, reminiscent of Helen of Troy. Wigs and hairpieces crafted from enslaved northern women were not uncommon among the elite. Eyebrows were pivotal. A singular, unbroken brow, a unibrow, was a mark of purity and sagacity. Women not naturally blessed would fashion one using powdered antimony or soot. Some even adhered goat hair between their brows to achieve that soft, scholarly mien. Perfumes were meticulously blended using olive oil as a base, combined with herbs like marjoram, thyme, and iris root. They were applied after bathing, a practice Greeks engaged in obsessively, often in public baths. Cleanliness was literally proximum datate. Within the verdant jungles and lofty highlands of Mesoamerica, beauty was neither delicate nor understated. For the Aztec and Mayan civilizations, beauty was audacious, a corporeal emblem of identity, authority, and sacred obligation. The quintessential physique was sculpted, incised, and at times painfully reshaped, all in devotion to the deities and societal standing. The most profound modification was cranial shaping. Among both Mayans and Aztecs, altering an infant's cranium was deemed an enhancement. From the earliest days of life, wooden boards were gently but firmly affixed to a child's head to elongate the skull into a sloping, almost conical form. This signified nobility, intellect, and beauty, with a longer, smoother forehead denoting higher social rank. Next came dental ornamentation. Forget modern whitening strips. Mayan elites embedded jade, turquoise, and even hematite into their teeth. Minute perforations were drilled with obsidian tools, and precious stones were affixed with natural resins. The sparkle when they smiled was literal, and their pain threshold astronomical. Filed teeth, sculpted into sharp points or symmetrical patterns, were also fashionable, emulating animal characteristics to suggest potency or divine connection. Skin and facial painting played a significant role in daily existence and ritual. Aztec women often employed red and yellow pigments on their cheeks, while both men and women utilized black paint for ceremonies. The hues carried profound meaning: red for vitality and fertility, black often for warfare or devoutness. Some paints were derived from pulverized insects like cochineal, yielding a vibrant crimson shade. Piercings and tattoos were spiritual pledges. Ear, nasal, and labial piercings, frequently adorned with jade or bone jewelry, were common. Tattoos, created with thorns and ink, displayed familial lineage, religious roles, or battlefield accolades. These were not subtle accessories but pronouncements of fealty to gods like Quetzalcoatl or Ixal. Even strabismus was considered appealing among the Maya. Mothers dangled beads before their infants' noses, training them to gaze inward until their eyes misaligned. This was perceived not as an imperfection but as a sign of mystical insight. Across the diverse topographies of ancient Africa, beauty was as varied as the terrain itself. From the fertile Nile Valley to the savannas of Nubia and the bustling mercantile cities of West Africa, beauty rituals were both pragmatic and deeply symbolic. Adornment was not merely a matter of style. It was a proclamation of identity, status, and cosmic alignment. In ancient Egypt, beauty approached the realm of scientific discipline. Both men and women applied kohl around their eyes, not merely for allure but for protection. The black pigment, derived from galena or lead sulfide, attenuated solar glare and prevented infections. The dramatic lines extending beyond the eyelids forged the famous almond-eyed aesthetic of Egyptian artistry. Eyes were regarded as sacred instruments, conduits to the divine. Perfume was both a luxury and an exigency. Egyptians cherished scent so profoundly they devised perfume cones. Wax cones infused with myrrh, cinnamon, and lotus oil were donned upon the head during ceremonies. As the cone yielded to the heat, it released fragrance, enveloping the hair and physique. Daily ablutions included scented oils after bathing, often applied from stone or alabaster vessels that were works of art in their own right. Skin care was rooted in both aesthetics and climatic endurance. Palm oil, shea butter, and castor oil shielded the skin from harsh sun and desiccating conditions. These oils were not merely moisturizing but medicinal, blended with herbs to mend wounds, soothe irritations, and preserve the skin's effulgence. Body scrubs crafted from sand or pulverized seeds kept skin exfoliated and pristine long before loofahs. In Nubia, coiffures were central to identity. Elaborate braids and shaved patterns conveyed tribal affiliation, age, and marital status. Hair was often tinctured with henna or embellished with beads, shells, and gold threads. A towering, sculpted coiffure was more than fashionable. It was regal. Further west, in ancient Yoruba or Songhai territories, body painting with indigo and ochre pigments played a role in rituals and festivities. Tribal markings, whether scarified or painted, were viewed not as imperfections but as beauty enhancements and indicators of strength and heritage. Beauty has consistently exacted a toll, time, effort, and financial outlay. But in the ancient world, it could also demand health, mental acuity, and even life itself. Across civilizations, the pursuit of flawlessness often encroached upon perilous territory. While these rituals were admired and even revered, they sometimes left cicatrices far deeper than superficial ones. We have already chronicled the alarming constituents: lead, arsenic, mercury, and pulverized insects, all employed in cosmetics and dermatological care. These substances shared a common attribute: toxicity. Lead facial powders, utilized in Rome, Greece, and Renaissance Europe, provoked hair loss, muscular paralysis, and gradual organ failure. Yet, the more pallid the skin, the greater its desirability, a poison veiled as a compliment. In ancient China, elite women sometimes underwent foot binding from an early age in pursuit of the lotus foot ideal, symbolizing grace and obedience. Although this practice gained more prominence in later dynasties, similar precursors existed earlier. The outcome was permanent deformity, but it was considered beauty, not brutality. And let us not overlook the ritualized agony of tattoos, piercings, and body modifications. For the Maya and Aztecs, embedding jade into teeth or reshaping crania was a badge of honor. However, the peril of infection, pain, and lasting damage was significant. Similarly, in ancient African and Middle Eastern cultures, Scarification was a testament to strength and beauty, but involved incising intricate patterns into the skin, often without antiseptic measures. Even fragrances could be hazardous. In Egypt, perfume cones sometimes contained cinnamon oil, which in high concentrations can cause dermal burns. And with water bathing being a luxury, heavy oils could occlude pores and trap bacteria, leading to infections. Cosmetics and treatments remained unregulated. One person's beauty secret could portend another's slow demise. Since many rituals were transmitted orally or in clandestine texts, misinformation was as ubiquitous as vanity itself. In every culture, the quest for beauty mirrored the epoch's values: power, divinity, nobility, virtue. But the cost was often silently borne, the scars concealed beneath powders, perfumes, and elaborate coiffures. Ancient games, play, strategy, and spirituality. Long before modern board games dominated domestic evenings, ancient Mesopotamians were captivated by the royal game of yore. Unearthed in the 1920s by Sir Leonard Woolley in the Royal Cemetery of Yore, this game dates back over 4.5 millennia. It was not merely a pastime. It was sacred, emblematic, and potentially cosmic. The board itself is a masterwork, a diminutive rectangular box adorned with 20 embellished squares of lapis lazuli, shell, and red limestone inlaid in bitumen. It bore a closer resemblance to a divine artifact than a mere diversion. Players propelled their tokens using tetrahedral dice, four-sided pyramidal forms, racing from one extremity of the board to the other. The objective: to maneuver all 7 pieces off the board before one's adversary. Simple as it sounds, it possesses profound layers. Some scholars posit the layout symbolizes a spiritual odyssey, a metaphor for the soul's progression through destiny and disarray. The central squares were conjectured to be hazardous or enchanted loci of chance, safeguarding, or divine arbitration. In this interpretation, triumph was not solely a matter of serendipity. It was about sagaciously navigating the cosmos. Deities were indeed implicated. Clay tablets from later periods described the game's application for augury. Scribes deciphered dice throws as portents, employing the game as a form of oracle. Imagine ancient tarot commingling with competitive backgammon. The royal game of yore was not confined to temples or palatial chambers. Variants have been discovered as far afield as India and Egypt, suggesting its dissemination along trade routes and its enthrallment of multiple civilizations. It might well have been the inaugural truly international board game, predating chess or checkers. For the ancient Sumerians, engaging with the royal game of yore transcended mere temporal diversion. It was an encounter with fate, a testing of divine favor, and perhaps a fleeting glimpse into the universe's concealed architecture. It was a game, a ritual, a race, and a rehearsal for eternity. Senet was more than a mere board game. It served as a spiritual transit pass to the afterlife. Played as early as 3100 BCE, Senet makes appearances in tomb murals, funerary papyri, and even reposed upon Tutankhamun's lap. For ancient Egyptians, Senet was not solely entertainment. It was a ceremonial simulation of the soul's perilous journey through the underworld, where each progression upon the board could reverberate through everlastingness. The Senet board featured 30 squares arrayed in 3 rows of 10. Each participant commanded 5 or 7 tokens, aiming to traverse them across and safely off the ultimate square. Movement was dictated by the casting of sticks or bones, functioning as rudimentary dice. Yet, serendipity alone would not secure victory. Strategy and opportune timing were paramount. What commenced as a casual diversion gradually acquired profound spiritual resonance. By the New Kingdom, approximately 1550 BCE, senet transcended mere domestic amusement. It evolved into a symbolic enactment of the soul's arduous voyage through the duat, the Egyptian netherworld. Specific squares represented pivotal stages of this journey: resurgence, judgment, peril, purification. Each turn was not just a wager but an invocation of celestial will. Senet's iconography became increasingly esoteric. Some boards bore hieroglyphic inscriptions of protective deities or incantations. Square 26 often symbolized the chamber of rebirth, while square 27 might denote the abode of felicity. Landing there could signify divine safeguarding, while other squares portended delay or danger. The board became a microcosm of the afterlife, a spiritual obstacle course delineated in cedar and pigment. Senet was also intimately linked to the goddess Maat, embodying rectitude, justice, and cosmic order. Engaging in Senet Adept was a symbolic rehearsal for navigating the afterlife's tribulations, where the soul would be weighed against Maat's feather. To conquer the game might signify conquering immortality. To falter, one would do well to hope for supplementary amulets interred within their tomb. Thus, while Senet may superficially resemble an ancient form of backgammon, it was far more: part diversion, part theological exposition, part spiritual compass to the realm beyond. In Egypt, one did not merely play Senet, one prayed through its movements. To the uninitiated gaze, knucklebones seemed like mere childish amusement, simply a handful of oddly contoured bones flung skyward. Yet, in ancient Greece, it transcended a simple pastime. It was a contest of dexterity, fortuity, subtle allure, and even divine symbolism. Whether amidst the vibrant Athenian agoras or within serene temple precincts, knucklebones clattered across stone pavements, echoing mirth, rivalry, and ritualistic undertones. The game was originally played with the small ankle bones of sheep or goats, known as a stragoloi. Unlike contemporary dice, these four-sided ossicles did not roll uniformly, rendering each cast inherently unpredictable. Participants propelled them into the air, striving to ensnare them upon the back of their hand or to orient them into specific configurations to accrue points. Rules varied by locale and epoch, but the excitement was universal. It was not exclusively for juveniles. Adults, particularly women, held it in high esteem. Greek amphory and statuary frequently depict young maidens in graceful raiment, engaging in knucklebones with profound concentration. For many, it represented a pursuit of elegance and nimbleness, a kind of ancient fidget toy combined with social ceremony. It even served as a form of courtship display, where a dexterous throw might ensnare a suitor's regard. But a deeper stratum existed. The astragoloi were often associated with destiny and the pantheon. Each facet bore a name and a numerical value, rendering them amenable to both recreation and augury. A felicitous throw might be interpreted as a sign from the gods, perhaps from Apollo or Hermes. And should one cast four identical sides, that constituted the coveted Venus throw, a flawless victory purportedly touched by divine grace. The game also held potent affiliations with mortality and the underworld. Knucklebones were frequently interred in sepulchres as playthings or instruments for divination in the subsequent existence. Some believed spirits could manipulate them, or that they facilitated posthumous prognostication. In due course, the game evolved, with Greeks casting knucklebones fashioned from bronze, glass, and ivory. Yet, the fundamental appeal persisted, effortlessly grasped, challenging to master, and steeped in an aura of mystique. In Greece, knucklebones were more than a game. They embodied flirtation, fate, and diversion, all encapsulated in a singular toss. If chess represents warfare on a checkered field, then ludus latrunculorum was Rome's martial proclamation. This archaic Roman game, frequently abbreviated to latrunculi or the skirmish of small warriors, was not merely a means to occupy time in a villa courtyard. It constituted an intellectual joust, a cerebral rehearsal for actual military engagement. To master it was to command the acumen of a general. The precise regulations of ludus latrunculorum have succumbed to the annals of time, yet fragments, wooden boards, clay figures, and literary allusions present a compelling tableau. Played upon a grid, often 8 by 8 or 9 by 10 squares, each combatant controlled a contingent of diminutive, standardized pieces termed latrones or mercenaries. The objective: to outmaneuver one's adversary and effect the capture of their pieces by encirclement. No aleatory devices, no fortuitous happenstance, solely sheer cunning. Its subtlety rendered it enthralling. This was not a linear race game like Senet. It was fundamentally tactical, demanding prescience and psychological stratagems. Players would entice, dissimulate, and ensnare, precisely mirroring actual military campaigns. Roman literati such as Varro and Ovid alluded to it as a recreation favored by both legionaries and statesmen. Some perceived it as a test of character. Others simply relished the public humiliation of companions. Intriguingly, the game was not confined to the aristocracy. Latrunculi boards have been discovered etched into stone pavements and even rooftops across the sprawling Roman Imperium, from Britannia to Aegyptus. Soldiers engaged in it while garrisoned on the frontiers. Merchants played it between commercial negotiations. It transcended social stratification and cultural boundaries, offering both escapism and strategic tutelage. The pieces themselves exhibited variation: unadorned pebbles, sculpted ivory tokens, or vitreous counters. Some boards showcased specialized squares, conceivably fortresses or regal seats, where pivotal captures might transpire. Scholars debate whether a solitary king piece existed in certain iterations, but regardless, the game rewarded ruthless cerebration over brute force. Roman poets frequently employed the game as a metaphor. The loss of a piece was likened to falling from favor in court, encirclement to political perfidy. Even the gods were purported to engage in versions of it, implying that strategic prowess was not solely human but also divinely ordained. Ludus latrunculorum may be defunct, but its spirit endures in modern games like chess and checkers. It was Rome's intellectual blood sport, a contest where triumph denoted more than mere bragging rights. It signified intellectual ascendancy. Prior to Senet's preeminence in ancient Egypt, there existed Mayhen, a cryptic spiral-shaped board game named after a protective Ophidian deity. Mayhen was more than a mere game. It was an enigma enshrouded in mythos, strategy, and ceremonial significance. While its precise mandates have dissipated into the sands of antiquity, extant boards and artifacts suggest Mayhen transcended simple recreation. It embodied cosmic symbolism in dynamic form. The board itself was visually arresting: a coiled serpent, its body demarcated into rectangular segments, spiraling inward towards its cephalic extremity. The serpent Mayhen was believed to safeguard the solar deity Ra during his nocturnal transit through the netherworld. Thus, each game effectively constituted a reenactment of a divine peregrination, participants navigating the convolutions of peril, metamorphosis, and spiritual genesis. The tokens discovered alongside Mayhen boards include diminutive, leonine-shaped figures and spherical marbles or orbs. Scholars postulate each player controlled a set of marbles that traversed the serpent's form, possibly escorted or menaced by the lion figures. The lions may have functioned as guardians, impediments, or even adversarial aggressors. While the mechanics of movement remain indistinct, it likely involved aleatory devices such as dice or casting sticks, analogous to other Egyptian pastimes. What renders Mayhen so profoundly captivating is its abrupt cessation. Popular throughout the Old Kingdom, approximately 2600 to 2300 BCE, it inexplicably vanished from historical records and archaeological vestiges by the Middle Kingdom. The rationale? It remains unknown. Some theorists conjecture its religious associations fell into disfavor. Others contend it was simply eclipsed by Senet's expanding role in funerary rites. Regardless, Mayhen became an artifact of the past, leaving behind only exquisitely designed serpent-shaped boards and tacit, lion-headed tokens. Its presence beyond Egypt's borders is equally intriguing. Analogous spiral boards have been unearthed in Cyprus and the Levant, suggesting the game, or at least its iconic representation, disseminated through commercial exchange or martial conquest. Did it retain its allegorical import in foreign territories, or was it divested of its mythic essence and reduced to a mere puzzle? The available evidence does not clarify, but the enduring mystery only amplifies Mayhen's allure. Ultimately, Mayhen was more than a diversion. It was a perambulation along the divine vertebral column of a serpent, a metaphorical exploration of safeguarding, hazard, and the eternal cycle of existence and cessation. To engage with it was to enter a spiral, a helix where each maneuver resonated with ancient myths. Long before the Norse chroniclers inscribed sagas or etched runestones, they immersed themselves in Tafel, a genus of asymmetric board games that starkly mirrored their brutal world of depredations, blockades, and sheer endurance. From the frigid confines of longhouses in Norway to the bustling trade enclaves of Ireland, Tafel games permeated the Norse milieu, honing intellects as keenly as they sharpened blades. These were not gentle diversions. Tafel condensed the essence of warfare into strategy, cunning, and meticulously calculated peril. The most celebrated iteration is Onofatafel, or King's Table, contested upon a square grid, most commonly 111 or T13. In the ancient world of games, where recreation intertwined with fate, several compelling pastimes emerged across diverse civilizations. These were not mere pastimes. They served as cosmic mirrors, proving grounds for leaders, and symbolic preparations for life's profound mysteries. The Viking game of Onofatafel, for instance, epitomized strategic imbalance. One player commanded a king and a small contingent of defenders at the board's core, while the opponent arrayed a larger attacking force from the periphery. The king's objective was to reach a corner square, a desperate bid for freedom. The attackers, conversely, aimed to encircle and capture the monarch. Devoid of dice or chance, Onofatafel was a pure test of intellect, foresight, and spatial dominance. Echoing Viking raids, The odds were intentionally skewed. Assailants outnumbered defenders 2-1, compelling the king's player to employ shrewd evasion and misdirection. Onofatafel boards, often fashioned from wood, antler, or stone, featured intricate grids and stylized pieces. More affluent warriors might possess versions crafted from glass or bone, with pieces resembling warriors, kings, or mythical beasts. These portable boards, easily carried on longships, embodied a shared essence of conflict despite regional rule variations. Onofatafel transcended simple amusement. It honed Viking minds for real-world leadership and ambush tactics. It instilled lessons in calculated retreat, opportune sacrifice, and multi-move anticipation. In a volatile era of shifting allegiances, the ability to predict an adversary's moves could determine victory or ruin. So deeply ingrained was Onofatafel in Norse culture that even Christian missionaries utilized it to engage with pagans, occasionally substituting the king piece with a bishop. However, with the medieval dissemination of chess into Scandinavia, Onofatafel gradually diminished, becoming a relic of forgotten beliefs. By the 12th century, it was nearly obsolete, though echoes persist in regional games like tablat. Yet, in its prime, Onofatafel was more than a board game. It was a Viking battlefield, albeit a quieter, cleaner one, played with bone rather than blood. Within the lavish courts of ancient India, amidst the splendor of elephants, aromatic incense, and sacred hymns, a game unfolded that transcended mere diversion, becoming a dance with destiny. Parcheesi, acclaimed as India's national game, was a profound expression of karma, regality, and deliberate risk. Its origins trace back to at least the 6th century CE, possibly earlier, and it was a cherished pursuit of emperors, particularly the legendary Akbar the Great, who embraced it not just as a game but as a philosophy of life. The game board, a colossal cross, symbolized the 4 cardinal directions and the convergence of fate. Each arm formed a path of squares leading to a central square representing the throne or sanctuary. Players navigated their 4 pieces around the board, aiming to return them all to the center before their adversaries. The unique element lay in the movement mechanism. 6 or 7 cowrie shells, not dice, determined progress. The number of shells landing open side up dictated movement, imbuing each turn with a blend of fortuity, choice, and divine whim. But Parcheesi wasn't solely about advancement. It was about capture. Landing on an opponent's piece sent them back to the start. Timing, positioning, and subterfuge were paramount. A precipitous move could spell catastrophe, while a patient strategy could dominate the board. It was a game of equanimity, akin to the intricacies of warfare or courtly intrigue. And its influence extended beyond the board. Akbar famously constructed a colossal courtyard version at Fate Basikri, where real individuals, clad in color-coded attire, served as game pieces. He directed the human tokens from above with regal authority, transforming the game into a spectacle, an act of statecraft, and a spiritual theater all at once. Parcheesi's symbolic depths ran profound. The cross-shaped board mirrored the convergence of dharma, duty, artha, prosperity, karma, desire, and moksha, liberation. Success demanded not only skill but also alignment with universal order. A well-played game, much like a well-lived life, balanced audacity with prudence. Later, British colonists adapted Parcheesi into Ludo, simplifying its rich symbolism. Yet, the original game endures as a masterpiece of ancient Indian thought. Parcheesi was more than a race. It was a profound lesson in destiny, forbearance, and the subtle interplay of karma across a board where every throw held significance. For an Aztec, casting the beans wasn't merely a wager, it was a sacred transaction. Patoli, one of Mesoamerica's most ancient known games, was a fusion of gambling, ritual, and cosmic drama. It was played in every setting, from humble village plazas to the grand temples of Tenochtitlan, invariably under the vigilant gaze of the gods, especially Macuilxochitl, the deity of games, dance, and revelry. The game board was deceptively simple. A cross-shaped grid typically inscribed on mats, stone, or even etched directly into temple steps. It comprised 52 spaces, echoing the Aztec calendar's 52-year cycle. This was no coincidence. Time, fate, and cosmic rhythms were intrinsically woven into every square. Players commenced with 6 beans marked with dots, functioning as rudimentary dice. These were tossed to determine the movement of a player's token. Each player possessed a set of markers, often stones, bones, or carved figurines, which they maneuvered around the board in an endeavor to complete a circuit before their adversary. But Patoli wasn't merely a race. It was a confrontation. Landing on an opponent's piece could send it back to the start, or worse, eliminate it entirely. However, peril was reciprocal. Certain squares were penalty zones linked to ill omens, where landing meant forfeiting progress or valuables. Indeed, valuables. For Patoli was not solely played for prestige. It was a full-fledged gambling spectacle. Players wagered everything from sustenance and blankets to gold dust, jade, and even enslaved people. High-stakes matches could be intense. Spectators congregated, cheering or jeering, and priests sometimes officiated to ensure fairness and spiritual decorum. Players offered tributes to Macuilxochitl before significant games, seeking good fortune or absolution in the event of loss. To engage in Patoli was to risk not only prosperity but also divine displeasure. Upon their arrival, the Spanish were aghast. They perceived Patoli as a conduit to vice and paganism. Gambling was prescribed, and boards were demolished. Nevertheless, the game persisted in memory, secretly transmitted or transformed into less perilous variations. What distinguished Patoli wasn't solely its mechanics but its fusion of chance, strategy, and cosmology. The board was a miniature cosmos. Each throw was a twist of fate, and every game mirrored the unending gamble between order and chaos, life and demise. Modern games are typically viewed as leisure activities, means to relax, compete, or pass the time. Yet, in antiquity, games frequently held sacred significance. They transcended mere entertainment. They were reflections of the cosmos, training grounds for rulers, and symbolic rehearsals for mortality, destiny, and rebirth. Across civilizations, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, play was never simply play. It was ritual in disguise. Consider Senet and Patoli, for example. These were not casual pastimes. They were imbued with religious meaning, often played in temples, tombs, and ceremonial settings. Senet boards were unearthed in the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs, not as toys but as instruments to guide the soul through the duat, the underworld. Victory in a Senet game wasn't about outwitting an opponent. It was about demonstrating spiritual preparedness for the afterlife. Similarly, in the Aztec world, Patoli was played under divine supervision. Macuilxochitl, the god of games and excess, demanded offerings and adherence. The throws of beans were not merely fortuitous or unfortunate. They were divine messages, indicators of favor or retribution. The loss of possessions could be seen as karmic justice, while winning signified a fleeting alignment with cosmic forces. Even more abstract games like Mayhen and Parcheesi carried profound symbolic weight. Mayhen reenacted the serpent god coiling around the sun god Ra during his nocturnal journey through the underworld. Every move on the board symbolized protection, progress, or peril. Parcheesi, with its cross-shaped design, wasn't just about reaching the center. It was a model of dharma, karma, and moksha. The entire spiritual cycle was rendered in cowrie shells and tokens. And the role of games in education and warfare cannot be overstated. Games like Ludus Latruncularum and Onofatafel were not simply diversions for soldiers. They were tactical simulations. Emperors, generals, and young nobles played them not just to achieve victory but to acquire knowledge. Games trained the mind to anticipate moves, counter threats, and balance aggression with strategy. They silently mold leaders away from the din of battle. Thus, whether they were played in sacred spaces, recited in courts, or inscribed in stone, ancient games fulfilled multifaceted roles. They provided amusement, yes, but they also educated, healed, judged, and prepared. They forged connections between humanity and the divine, between players and fate, and between time and eternity. In the ancient world, when one sat down to play, they weren't escaping life. They were immersing themselves more deeply within it. Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin's arrival on August 30th, 1797, immersed her in an intellectual tempest, bearing a weight of expectation that few experience in a lifetime. She was born to Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin, two of the era's most radical intellects. Her mother, author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, fearlessly championed women as rational beings deserving of education and parity. Her father, a political philosopher and novelist, repudiated monarchy, organized religion, and conventional marriage. Together, they forged a profoundly revolutionary partnership in Enlightenment England. Tragically, just 11 days after Mary's birth, her mother passed away. From its very inception, Mary's life was defined by both brilliance and profound bereavement. Reared by her father in a home teeming with books, concepts, and visiting radicals, she grew up surrounded by the spectral presence of a mother she never knew, yet whose voice resonated through her writings. Her father not only allowed her to read these works but actively encouraged it, providing an education far from ordinary. She absorbed Greek myths, science, poetry, philosophy, and history before most children mastered crafting a paragraph. The garden became her classroom, her intellect nurtured by the likes of Locke, Rousseau, and Voltaire. However, the household was far from idyllic. William Godwin eventually remarried, and Mary's relationship with her stepmother, Mary Jane Clement, was strained and contentious. The new Mrs. Godwin favored her own children, perceiving Mary as a temperamental, defiant girl with an overactive imagination. Mary, for her part, resented the domestic expectations imposed upon her, finding solace only in writing and dreaming. By age 10, she was crafting her own narratives. By 14, she was delving into texts that most adults would shy away from. She was not destined for a life of embroidery and tea. She was a storm quietly gathering momentum. Mary's childhood, shaped by the tenets of political revolution, personal liberty, and feminist defiance, laid the groundwork for an unparalleled existence. Her origins were tinged with death, defined by genius, and forged in the crucible of experience. She was not merely her parents' daughter. She was already transforming into something more enigmatic and profoundly powerful. Mary Shelley, the future progenitor of science fiction. In the summer of 1814, a mere 16-year-old Mary Godwin embarked on an act that would ignite scandal throughout literary London. She eloped, not alone, but with the already married, intensely idealistic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, a man 5 years her senior who was both her father's admirer and his deepest disappointment. What began as a romantic defiance would soon unravel into sorrow, expatriation, and creative fervor. Mary encountered Percy at her father's residence, where the poet frequently visited to engage in philosophical debates and pay homage to Godwin's writings. Yet, it was Mary, not her father, who captivated him. Quiet yet intense, she shared Percy's fascination with freedom, science, and the supernatural. They read together by her mother's grave in St. Pancras churchyard, a place where Mary often sought solace in the presence of the woman she had never known. It was there, amidst tombstones and candlelit books, that their love story unfurled. Their departure was sudden and impetuous. Mary, Percy, and Mary's stepsister, Claire Clement, left England, crossing the Channel to France with scant belongings and no defined itinerary. Percy abandoned his pregnant wife, Harriet, a decision that would cast a long shadow over all of them. The trio journeyed on foot through revolutionary France and Switzerland, writing in their journals by day and sleeping in humble inns by night. Their funds quickly depleted, forcing a disgraced return to England. A cascade of hardships ensued. Percy's creditors pursued them. Mary's father, once a proponent of free love, disowned her, and their children began to perish. Mary gave birth to a daughter who died within weeks. "Dream that my little baby came to life again," she confided in her journal, "awake and find no baby." Grief had infiltrated her being, never to depart. Yet, amidst the turmoil, Mary's intellect sharpened. She devoured books, Greek myths, alchemy, galvanism, scientific theories of reanimation. She lived in exile, a radical woman in a conventional world. Her relationship with Percy was both captivating and draining. He was brilliant, unpredictable, emotionally distant, yet ardently supportive of her writing. Mary Shelley had become an outcast, but she was not a victim. Her life, already brimming with defiance and anguish, was laying the foundation for something extraordinary. And in just a few short years, on the shores of Lake Geneva, inspiration would strike. In the summer of 1816, Mary Godwin, now Mary Shelley, found herself at the epicenter of one of literary history's most renowned holidays. She was in Switzerland, residing at the Villa Diodati by Lake Geneva with her lover Percy Shelley, her stepsister Claire Clement, the infamous Lord Byron, and Byron's physician, John Polidori. The weather was abysmal, a consequence of the previous year's eruption of Mount Tambora. The skies were thick with ash, crops failed, and temperatures plummeted, leading to the year without a summer. Confined indoors, the group entertained themselves by sharing ghost stories and engaging in discussions about science, poetry, and philosophy. One evening, Byron proposed a challenge. Each person should craft their own supernatural tale. A creative tempest began to brew, one that would irrevocably alter literature. Mary was merely 18. Byron and Shelley were already celebrated poets. Polidori would later author The Vampire, a precursor to Dracula. But it was Mary, quiet and discerning, who would defy expectations. Initially, she struggled to conceive an idea. Days passed. Then, during a conversation about galvanism, the application of electricity to reanimate inert tissue, something ignited within her. That night, Mary experienced a profound vision. In her own words, "I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out." She had dreamt of a scientist and the monstrous being he brought to life. Thus was conceived Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. The novel was more than mere horror. It was a synthesis of science, myth, and sorrow. Victor Frankenstein's obsession with creating life mirrored the era's fascination with scientific advancement. The creature, spurned and unloved, reflected Mary's own feelings of abandonment and otherness. Themes of parenthood, isolation, and culpability permeated every page, drawn from her personal losses and the tumultuous men in her life. When Frankenstein was published in 1818, it appeared anonymously. Many assumed Percy had authored it. He had penned the preface. He was the husband. He was the man. But the truth could not remain concealed. The world would come to recognize Mary Shelley not only as the wife of a poet, but as the progenitor of science fiction. In one summer, she had transmuted lightning, death, and her own grief into an undying monster. Following the genesis of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's life did not transition into literary triumph. Instead, it descended deeper into sorrow. Death had perpetually shadowed her, but in the years after 1818, it relentlessly closed in. Even as her creation began to permeate the public imagination, her own family started to dwindle. Mary and Percy returned to England, where grief struck once more. Their two young children, Clara and William, both succumbed, Clara to dysentery in Italy, William to malaria shortly thereafter. Mary was devastated, having lost 3 children in as many years. The pain was boundless. She wrote, "I am not now in a state to be comforted." She isolated herself, her mind clouded by nightmares, and her health began to decline. Yet, amidst the sorrow, a flicker of life emerged. In 1819, she gave birth to her sole surviving child, Percy Florence Shelley. He would become her steadfast anchor in the ensuing years. But even he could not shield her from the next devastating blow. In 1822, tragedy struck again, this time with brutal suddenness. Percy Shelley drowned in a storm while sailing off the coast of Italy. His body washed ashore, unrecognizable save for a volume of Keats's poetry in his pocket. Mary was just 24 years old, widowed, impoverished, and emotionally shattered. She had endured the deaths of 3 children, her half-sister Fanny's suicide, the suicide of Percy's estranged wife Harriet, and now the drowning of the love of her life. It was a gothic horror no fiction could parallel. Yet somehow, she persevered. Mary collected Percy's remains, both literal and literary. She safeguarded his poems, his reputation, and even purportedly kept a piece of his calcified heart, wrapped in silk, in her writing desk. Grief was no longer just a companion, it was her enduring muse. And through it all, she continued to write. Her pen became her lifeline. She composed Valperga, a historical novel, and The Last Man, a post-apocalyptic vision of plague and isolation that eerily mirrored her own desolation. And she meticulously edited and published Percy's works, ensuring his legacy would not be lost with him. Mary Shelley didn't merely survive tragedy. She absorbed it, transformed it, and transmuted it into art. Love had defined her early years, but now loss would sculpt her myth. By the mid-1820s, Mary Shelley was uniquely alone for a young woman of her era. At just 28, she had already interred most of her loved ones: her parents, her children, her half-sister, her husband. What remained was her pen, her son Percy Florence, and the oppressive weight of her legacy. She was no longer the rebellious teenager who had fled England for love. She was now a widow, a single mother, and a woman encircled by specters. And yet, she endured. Financially precarious, Mary relied on her writing for survival. But Victorian society was unforgiving of women who had experienced too much. She was judged not only as a female author but as the scandalous wife of a controversial poet. Publishers desired her to be palatable, respectable. Consequently, she learned to navigate the literary world with caution, balancing her radical past with the necessity of providing a stable life for her son. She wrote tirelessly, novels such as Perkin Warbeck, Lodore, and Faulkner. Each explored themes of political exile, absent mothers, and moral conflict. They were not as revolutionary as Frankenstein, but they reflected her evolving perspective, less idealistic, more grounded, and deeply introspective. She also produced biographies, travel journals, and countless editorial projects, including the monumental task of preserving and promoting Percy Shelley's poetry. She shaped his legacy with the same diligence she once applied to her own narratives. But Mary was not merely a guardian of memories. She remained intellectually acute, politically engaged, and fiercely protective of her privacy. She declined multiple marriage proposals. She refused to publish gossip or divulge secrets. She maintained friendships with writers, philosophers, and publishers, but trusted very few. Her deepest devotion was to her son, Percy Florence. She ensured he received the finest education, shielded him from scandal, and provided him with the tranquil life she herself had been denied. In doing so, she cultivated a semblance of stability that had eluded her for decades. Mary's later life was marked by physical ailments, recurring headaches and paralysis in her right arm. But she never ceased writing, never ceased thinking, never ceased being the woman who had confronted grief and defied it with ink and paper. She was the last survivor, not untouched by tragedy, but undefeated by it. Her life was no longer merely a Gothic novel. It was an act of profound endurance. By her 30s, Mary Shelley had become a quiet force in the literary sphere, not through widespread acclaim but through sheer tenacity. She was no longer simply Percy Shelley's widow or the daughter of renowned radicals. She was Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, a novel that, with the passage of time, had begun to assume a peculiar life of its own. Initially, Frankenstein had been dismissed by critics. Some viewed it as a disconcerting oddity. Others presumed her husband had written it. But the public remained captivated. By the 1830s, the narrative had already begun to transcend the written page. Theatre adaptations proliferated across Europe, including The Popular Presumption, or The Fate of Frankenstein, which depicted the creature as a mute brute, a stark departure from Mary's eloquent, tragic original. Still, it affirmed the novel's cultural potency. Her monster was no longer exclusively hers. It belonged to the world. And with that came something extraordinary. A new genre began to coalesce. Frankenstein had unwittingly given birth to science fiction. Long before Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, Mary Shelley had posed the chilling question, what happens when man plays God? She had seamlessly blended Gothic horror with Enlightenment-era science, weaving human tragedy through speculative imagination. It was not merely a horror story, it was a prescient warning. Mary herself did not claim to have invented a genre. In fact, she rarely drew attention to herself at all. But scholars now acknowledge her as the mother of science fiction, a title she earned not through explicit intention but through groundbreaking innovation. She had taken the anxieties of her era, concerning science, morality, motherhood, and death, and molded them into a timeless parable. As she edited Peirce's works and navigated the male-dominated publishing world, Mary subtly influenced generations of thinkers. Her writings explored not only politics and feminism but also ecological catastrophe, existential dread, and ethical boundaries. Her 1826 novel, The Last Man, envisioned a world devastated by plague and isolation, a vision that would only be fully appreciated a century later. Though often ill in her later life, she never ceased engaging with the world through her writing. Her legacy was already in motion, emerging from the laboratory, across the stage, through the press, and into the very fabric of modern culture. Mary Shelley had imbued an idea with life, an idea that would never die. And for that, literature would be irrevocably transformed. Mary Shelley's existence was shaped not only by affection and sorrow but also by identity, an identity she was perpetually compelled to defend, reinterpret, and safeguard. To be a woman writer in the 19th century was already an inherently political act. To be Mary Shelley, the offspring of revolutionaries, the widow of a radical poet, and the architect of a morally intricate monster, rendered her very being even more fraught with meaning. After Peirce's demise, Mary found herself in a precarious position. Although she had adopted his surname through marriage, her standing as his literary executor and the custodian of his legacy was not assured. His family, the aristocratic Shelleys, had never approved of Mary. They regarded her with suspicion, deemed her dangerous, and offered her a meager allowance contingent on her remaining uninvolved in their affairs. They permitted her to raise her son but curtailed her freedom of expression. Mary played a protracted and meticulous game. She trod a fine line between respectability and rebellion, cultivating a public persona that was reserved, literary, and maternal, while subtly preserving her radical heritage beneath the surface. When editing Peirce's poetry and composing his memoirs, she judiciously sanitized his atheism and revolutionary views, ensuring his works would reach a broader, more conservative Victorian audience. Critics have debated this decision for decades. Was it an act of betrayal or shrewd strategy? Perhaps it was both. Mary understood the intricacies of reputation better than most. But while she strove to preserve Peirce's legacy, she also championed her own. Publishers desired her to be silent, anonymous, or at best, a mere footnote to her husband's genius. Mary refused. She continued to author novels under her own name. In an era when women still published under male pseudonyms, Mary Shelley insisted on visibility. Concurrently, she subtly integrated political themes into her fiction. In Lodore and Faulkner, she explored issues of female autonomy, flawed fatherhood, and the societal limitations placed on women. In The Last Man, she imagined the collapse of civilization and the futility of empire, hardly veiled commentary. Mary Shelley's pen was not merely a creative instrument, it was a formidable weapon. Through fiction, biography, and meticulous editorial work, she shaped not only the memory of a generation but the very framework of modern literature. As the Victorian era flourished around her, Mary Shelley entered her final decade with quiet dignity, overshadowed by physical decline and emotional solitude. Although still recognized for her intellect and literary contributions, the world that had once vibrated with radicalism and romanticism was receding, and Mary stood as one of its last living witnesses. The vibrant circle of her youth, Byron, Percy, Clare, even her father William Godwin, had vanished. The revolutionary fire of the early 1800s had yielded to Victorian decorum. Mary found herself increasingly alone, burdened by chronic illness. She suffered from debilitating headaches, partial paralysis in her arms, and what may have been a recurring brain tumor. Yet, she rarely voiced complaint. Her pain simply became an integrated part of her routine, like ink merging with paper. Still, she remained devoted to her son, Percy Florence Shelley, who had matured into a handsome and affectionate young man. Unlike his parents, Percy Florence embraced a conventional life, eventually inheriting the baronetcy denied to his father. Mary clung to his companionship, focusing her remaining energy on ensuring his success and safeguarding him from scandal, particularly the specters that continued to pursue the Shelley name. Though her days of audacious creation were behind her, Mary continued her work. She maintained correspondence with publishers, friends, and fellow intellectuals. She continued to read extensively, history, science, political theory, remaining intellectually engaged even as her body failed her. She persevered in editing Percy's works, meticulously curating his poetic legacy while cautiously navigating his more inflammatory pieces to preserve public favor. But the shadows never entirely lifted. She lived modestly, sometimes on the brink of poverty, and never remarried. For Mary, marriage was never about security. It had been about fervent passion and shared ideals. No one else could occupy the void Percy had left, nor would she permit them to try. In 1851, at the age of 53, Mary Shelley succumbed to what was likely a brain tumor. She passed peacefully, surrounded by her son and his wife. After her death, among her belongings were discovered locks of hair from her lost children and the rumored fragment of Percy Shelley's heart, encased in silk. Even in death, Mary Shelley remained the guardian of memory. A woman shaped by loss, elevated by genius, and driven to write through every shadow.